All right, everyone, continuing now with Chapter 12, starting off with Section 3 of your notes, talking about various formats of information programming. Not so much talking about the formats themselves in this section. We'll kind of get into that more as we go on through the notes. But just in the general sort of sense, as we talk about the way syndication works within some of these formats. First off, syndication versus network. In the radio environment, this line tends to be kind of blurred. You have a lot of integration of various shows with satellite radio, with web-based delivery, with podcasting, all these things kind of going on, and you have different companies working with each other on certain sorts of things, where a network in many times may act in the way that a syndicator does, where you may not have a station that is 24/7 associated with a particular network. The greatest example of that would be ESPN Radio and its sports programming that is heard on stations all over the country with that ESPN branding. But it is very much possible for stations to pick and choose certain shows that come from certain networks, just like they would from certain syndicators. So that line gets kind of blurry. Now, some worry that national syndication deals will leave talented newcomers no place to develop their skills on local radio. And that's kind of a two-edged sort of statement. On one hand, yes, you do have a lot of stations that are picking up these national shows that are delivered by satellite or by internet to run on the airwaves. So it means less people that are working on the air developing their skills. But at the same time, you also have a lot of smaller stations that do see themselves as a more full service sort of station that still devotes at least part of its broadcast day to providing local news and information and various call-in types of shows. Now, some predict the next crop of talented talk personalities won't come from radio, but they'll come from digital platforms. Basically, i.e. podcasting, i.e. internet streaming. Those that want to develop themselves to be ready for a more national audience may look at new media as a way to develop their skill in the hopes that a traditional radio station or network would notice them and pick them up. And then there's some that are just very happy with staying on internet streams and doing podcasts and have built up a certain amount of success in that way. All right, first off, news formats. The all-news format consists of continuous newscasts. These are usually done in 20 to 30-minute segments for 24 hours each day. You tend to find these stations on in more larger markets because the news staffs and such are in a way that it requires a lot of personnel to continually gather news is something that requires a certain amount of manpower, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, because stations following this format repeat news cycles over and over, because even though you have people constantly searching for news, there's not always new news to share. They tend to attract listeners for short periods of time, generally long enough to listen to a complete cycle, maybe 2 or 3 cycles of content. So, if you're tuning in and you're listening to an hour of news on an all-news station, you're likely going to have heard the same sort of things a couple of times over the course of your listening to that station. This means that the all-news format is a high cum, low TSL, time spent listening, high Q, low TSL format. It depends on the high cumulative ratings to counteract the low time spent listening numbers. So for a all-news station, the idea is to get as many unique earlobes as you can listening to the station for a certain period of time over the course of a week. Now, given that listeners are constantly tuning in and out of all news stations, commercials, program elements, and promos must be scheduled much more frequently than in other formats in order to obtain an effective frequency among the constantly changing audience. They do this in a couple of ways. Number one, it's possible for an advertiser to have its commercial run multiple times within an hour. And that's so that they can get saturation from those that are tuning in, tuning out, all that sort of thing. It also means that the program clock of an all-news station is going to have many more commercial breaks within the hour, but those commercial breaks tend to only be 1 or 2 minutes long. So you could have many commercial breaks within even just a 30-minute news cycle, but they're not going to be long commercial breaks because of the way that they structure the news and the various segments that go in within that news wheel. The mix of news and information is a programming strategy. Some stations choose to have the philosophy that every story needs to have a local angle. If it is the news station for a particular community, they are going to focus on the news that impacts that community in one way or another. So you may not hear as much world news or even national news as much as you do things that are happening in your community, in your county, in your state. Other stations take another approach, and they say that the news needs to be the type of information that can be talked about in the break room at work or with a friend that you meet for lunch. And that could mean anything from covering all the topics in the news world, from politics to what's going on in Washington to some of the other more titillating or sensational sorts of things like entertainment gossip, and weird news and things like that, in order to keep the interest of the listener and to seem like the news station is relevant about the things that people everywhere are talking about. Now, as far as network-delivered newscasts, what tends to be a trend, especially with the all-news stations, is that traditional radio networks are kind of shifting. You're not necessarily hearing that top-of-the-hour national news on an all-news station by and large. What's happening is that the national networks are becoming more of a source for original sound bites. Stations then use the network sound bites to craft their own custom newscasts. In smaller markets and on less successful stations, in larger markets, network newscasts can still be heard in their entirety. So it's part of that philosophy of how a station views the way that it delivers news, especially if the news station sees itself as more having that local angle sort of approach. Then it's going to be counterintuitive for that station to air a newscast that comes from New York or Washington and doesn't really hit on the stories that matter to the people in the hometown. But they may instead then take those sound bites that the national news is covering and integrate them within the local newscast. Stations that choose not to carry the newscast in full are required by network affiliation contracts to be broadcasting the commercials at the very least, because, again, we're all in it for the money. Stations must schedule the network's commercials in time periods equivalent to when they would have aired in the newscast. So if they're not running, say, the top of hour newscast, and there was 60 seconds worth of commercials that were supposed to air within that top of hour newscast, then you would expect, or the network would expect rather, that those commercials would air sometime within that window close to the top of the hour. After the replacement commercials air, station personnel produce affidavits for the networks affirming the times and dates the network spots ran. So it's either a piece of paper or some sort of online form that a station will fill out saying, yes, we aired your commercial that you required us to air. We aired it at this date and this time. And then that gets signed off usually by the traffic manager of a radio station. And then that gets sent off to the network to fulfill their requirements, to show that they fulfilled requirements. News scheduling priorities. The basic elements of newscasting at an all-news station will include hard news copy. It'll include recapitulations or recaps for short of major stories. It'll include question and answer material from outside reporters. Many times these may also involve interviews with certain newsmakers. They'll air results of public opinion polls, and they'll air telephone actualities from these various newsmakers. And actuality is basically just a fancy term for an interview or a soundbite that isn't overtly made by a reporter or an anchor. Predictability is important in news programming because the audience will get used to coming to the station at specific times for program elements. So many times news stations will have weather and traffic reports, and many of them will offer them 4 times an hour or 6 times an hour. The morning and afternoon news on WPTF in Raleigh, for example, touts their traffic and weather on the 8s, so that, you know, if you're commuting in your car and you want to know what traffic's going to be like on I-40, you know you can tune into AM 680 at 8 past the hour or 18 past the hour or 38 past the hour or whatever time to be able to get an update on what's happening on the roadways. Many times they will also schedule sports in that way. Say at like 15 past and 45 past the hour. Business news may come on at a certain time every hour. The recaps of top stories will come on at a certain time every hour. So those that listen to news stations like that certain amount of predictability so that they can tune into the station to catch just the information that they want to hear. Now, let's move on to talk. Various types of talk formats that are out there will share the top 10 in this list. First off, heritage talk. These are stations that used to be known as full-service stations and are still kind of called that in many markets. Full-service stations tend to run the gamut of the various types of information that they provide and can be a mix of news and talk. Sometimes they're all talk. But many times when we're talking about the heritage stations, not only are they full service stations, but they're the 50,000 watt clear channel stations. These are the ones that can broadcast at full power day and night. And many times these AM stations are stations that you can hear over a wide swath of the country. If you flip through the AM dial during the nighttime hours here in our area, you can pick up radio stations from New York, from Pittsburgh, from Boston, from Baltimore, from Atlanta, from St. Louis. I think I've even heard Chicago once. You can tune in and get all of these stations, and all of these would be categorized as heritage talk or news talk stations. Politics and issues talk. This one tends to be the one that most people associate talk stations with. It's discussion of the latest issues coming from Washington or around the world or in your local area. Scholars have recognized that political talk radio is more effective than many other forms of mass media at generating a sense of solidarity and community among its audience members. Again, if there's particular issues that you are passionate about and you find somebody that agrees with your point of view or at times disagrees with your point of view, you're going to get people that tune into that station to kind of identify with that content. Rush Limbaugh, who tends to be one of the more polarizing of the talk radio hosts, at least has the biggest name that's still out there at the current time, actually has people that listen, and these people that listen are listening for the advertisers that buy time on Rush Limbaugh's show for the purpose of sharing with the public the advertisers that run on Rush Limbaugh's show in an effort to get people to boycott those advertisers. So the haters sometimes make it a job of listening to the people that they hate in efforts to demonetize them, to get advertisers to not advertise on that show, or to punish the advertisers that decide they're going to support a particular program. Sports talk appeals to men in the 25 to 54 and in the 18 to 34 age groups. These are elusive demographics that are sought out by many advertisers. Often programmers who affiliate with sports networks choose not to schedule all the available programming, electing instead to schedule local hosts to discuss professional, minor league, collegiate, and even high school sports of interest to the local market. There are stations that will run ESPN Sports 24/7 or Fox Sports 24/7, but many times those shows are going to be interspersed with one or two or more local sports shows that concentrate more on sports within the local area. Some consultants prefer to call the format Guy Talk because what makes the format work is a combination of the games themselves and a celebration of the lifestyle that goes with them. In sports radio, capturing on the air the lifestyle of the sports fans is what really makes this format work. There does tend to be, at least on certain shows, more of a locker room sort of feel, if I can say it that way. And that's something that is appealing to a certain segment of the population. Success Talk. This format, also known as Money Talk or Business Radio, offers listeners a mix of investment and personal advice for financial success. Some programmers of Success Talk also include programs that focus on health and recreation, chic travel, vacations, other sorts of upscale kinds of entertainment. So if you're very much interested in investments and the business world and, creating your fortune and knowing how to spend your money once you create that fortune, Success Talk is for you. Hot Talk. This format focuses on discussions of sexual issues that are presented in a titillating way to appeal to the male audience. That's somewhat of a... that may not necessarily be a fair definition for hot talk. Hot talk can at times also include other sorts of lifestyle types of talk, whether it's things about style or culture or things like that. It doesn't necessarily just have to be content that appeals to a certain male demographic. But many times when people think of hot talk, they think about that sort of content. Those types of shows that the author talks about as the definition of hot talk are trying to develop a sound that expresses a rock and roll attitude without the music. And in some ways, there is sort of a almost sort of a reality programming sort of vibe that may come about from certain hot talk programs. And the whole, following what's happening in the world of reality shows, what's happening in terms of the nightlife culture and things like that. Those things can also be incorporated into the hot talk sort of formats. Urban talk. The approach usually follows that of heritage or political talk, but the issues are those with a strong appeal to black listeners. And we're starting to see more and more of these kind of stations pop up around the country. Within recent months, iHeartRadio has started what's called the Black Information Network, and it is airing in part or in whole on several stations around the United States. The closest stations to us airing the format are in Charlotte and Atlanta, and also in Richmond, Virginia. But American Urban Radio Network's also a big player in this sort of programming. Tom Joyner's morning show, definitely fitting within this category. Faith talk shows and preaching programs centered around Christianity. Mostly what we tend to think of when we think of faith talk, also known as Christian teaching and talk. Other religions starting to get into the fray as well. Christian stations pretty much dominate across the United States, but there are stations that are focusing on Judaism and on Islam, and a couple other stations here and there that focus on other types of religions as well. Spanish and foreign language talk, Univision Radio and ESPN Deportes becoming popular among an increasing U.S. Hispanic audience. Health and help talk programs usually supplement content and other talk stations, especially on weekends. These can include other special interest types of content like home improvement and gardening. Basically, these would be shows that might not necessarily make up an entire broadcast schedule, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but they can be integrated into various schedules of other talk formats, helping to kind of complement the schedule. And finally, technology talk, which I would consider a division of health and help talk. Basically, this would be anything related to computers and technology. Into Tomorrow and Kim Commando are a couple of popular shows in this genre, and these are usually offered once a week. So let's take a break at this point. One more section, one more video, I should say, to cover this chapter, and I'll see you over there. It's part C of chapter 12.